The first signal came in at 0347 station time, and I almost missed it. I was reviewing trade manifests in my quarters aboard the Kethori Observer station when the emergency channel cut through every open frequency without warning. No preamble, no diplomatic header, just raw data. A burst transmission from the outer colonial sectors, compressed and flagged with a priority code I had only ever seen used twice in my career. I pulled up the feed and let it run. Verath Prime was gone. Not damaged, not under siege. Gone. The colony of 4,217,000 human settlers, farmers, engineers, teachers, children, had ceased to exist in a window of 11 minutes. The Dravathi supremacy had sent 3 warship divisions to the edges of that quiet, green world and reduced every structure, every field, every breathing thing on its surface to ash and silence. The transmission included sensor logs from a passing Ulari cargo vessel that had been close enough to capture the heat bloom. I watched the data render into an image I will carry for the rest of my life. I filed my incident report at 0412. I noted the estimated casualty figure, the identity of the aggressor, the coordinates, and the time. I classified it as a Category 4 colonial incident under Assembly Record-Keeping Protocol. Then I sent a formal notification to the Human Diplomatic Liaison Office on the station. A quiet man named Owen Garrett who kept his desk very tidy and always offered tea when I visited, and I waited for the response that I was certain would come within the hour. It did not come within the hour. It did not come that day. By the third morning after Verath Prime, I had sent 4 follow-up communications to the Human Liaison Office. Owen Garrett acknowledged each one with a single line. Received and logged. No demands. No statement of grief. No emergency session requested. No fleet mobilization notices filed with the Assembly Transit Registry, which all member species were required to submit before moving more than 40 vessels through shared space. Nothing. I found that silence deeply unsettling, and I could not fully explain why. My colleagues did not share my concern. Investigator Doss of the Pilari delegation came by my station on the 4th morning, with a cup of something warm and a look of mild amusement. He said that perhaps the humans lacked the capacity to respond. He reminded me, not unkindly, that humanity had only held provisional assembly membership for 62 years, that their total registered fleet numbered, according to last cycle's submission, somewhere around 4,300 vessels, a respectable number for a developing species, but not one that gave any major power reason for concern. He said that what I was interpreting as dangerous silence was probably just grief, in a species that had not yet learned how to turn grief into action. I told him I was not sure about that. He patted the side of my desk and left. I sat with the silence a while longer. On the 5th day, I walked to the Human Liaison Office myself. Owen Garrett was at his desk. His tea was hot. He looked, as he always did, entirely composed. A man in his mid-50s with steady hands and calm gray eyes that gave nothing away. I asked him directly if humanity intended to bring a formal complaint before the Assembly. He said that a response was being prepared. I asked what form that response would take. He said he was not authorized to discuss it. I asked him if he was afraid. He looked at me for a long moment, then he picked up his tea, took a slow sip, and said no. Not the no of a man hiding fear. The no of a man who had already made his peace with what was coming, and was simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. I went back to my quarters and filed an addendum to my incident report. In the notes section I wrote, "The human response, or absence of it, warrants continued observation." I flagged it for my senior counsel's attention. I did not expect them to take it seriously. They did not. What I did not know, sitting in my quarters on that 5th quiet day, filing careful notes into a record that no one would read until it was far too late, what none of us knew, not the Dravathi, not the Pilari, not the Assembly Council, not any of the 41 species that made up the great intergalactic body that presumed to govern the civilized galaxy, was that the silence was not absence. The silence was preparation. The silence had been preparation for a very long time. I thought about the Dravathi's statement, which had been brief and bloodless. Their council had described Verath Prime as an incidental clearance of unclaimed territory. They had noted, in careful diplomatic language, that humanity had not yet achieved the protected species threshold as defined by Assembly Charter, a threshold that required either a minimum fleet capability index or a formal security partnership with a recognized galactic power. Humanity met neither requirement. The Dravathi had therefore concluded, with the particular arrogance of a species that had held military dominance for 4 centuries, that there was no legal barrier to what they had done, and no meaningful consequence to follow. I had covered enough assembly history to know that they were probably right. Probably. I pulled up everything I could find on human colonial development patterns over the past several decades. Trade routes, resource extraction agreements, infrastructure contracts. I told myself I was being thorough. I told myself the addendum needed supporting detail. What I was actually doing, though I would not have admitted it then, was looking for something. Some evidence that the stillness had a shape, that the quiet had edges. I did not find it that day, but I remembered, as I closed the files and dimmed my screen, that there is a particular kind of quiet that falls over a place not because nothing is there, but because everything that is there is holding its breath. I had felt that kind of quiet once before, years earlier, during a border survey mission in a disputed sector near the Calith Reach. We had been scanning an apparently empty stretch of space when our senior navigator had suddenly gone very still and said, softly, that she did not think the sector was empty at all. She said it felt like the space was full of something that was not moving because it had chosen not to move yet. We had left that sector quickly and filed a hazard notation. I thought about that navigator as I prepared for sleep on the 5th night after Vareth Prime. I thought about her quiet, knowing voice. I thought about Owen Garrett and his steady hands and his unhurried tea, and I did not sleep well. The 6th morning brought nothing. The 7th brought nothing. The assembly moved on. Other matters rose to fill the agenda. The Dravathi filed a routine territorial registry update, and it was processed without comment. Life continued in the way that life always continues, in small, ordinary moments, stacked end to end, punctuated now and then by something enormous that the small moments struggle to absorb. I kept watching. I kept my incident file open on my secondary screen, and I waited for the silence to end. On the morning of the 9th day, it ended. Not with a voice. Not with a fleet. Not with anything I could point to and say, there, that is the thing. That is the response. It ended with a single line of text, transmitted from the human embassy on the station, to every member delegation simultaneously, flagged as a general notice rather than a formal communique. It read, "Humanity acknowledges the events of Vareth Prime, and is currently attending to the matter." That was all. I read it 3 times. Then I opened a new file, separate from the incident report, and I titled it simply, Observations. I wrote the first line. I wrote, "I do not think we are watching humanity respond." I wrote, "I think humanity has already responded, and we are simply waiting to understand what we are seeing." I saved the file. I locked it with my personal cipher. Then I went to find Owen Garrett. His office was empty. His desk was clean. His tea things were put away. A small sign on the door, printed in both Cathori script and standard, read, "Liaison Office temporarily unoccupied. For assembly matters, please contact the Deputy Registrar." I stood in the doorway for a long time. The hallway was quiet. Everything was very, very quiet. And somewhere, in the dark between stars, something vast was moving. I just did not know it yet. None of us did. But we were about to find out. The Assembly emergency session was called for the 72nd hour mark after Vareth Prime. Not because anyone demanded it, but because the Polari delegation had requested a routine status update on the incident, and the chair had decided a formal session was cleaner than a memo. It was not expected to be significant. Most delegates arrived with the mild, distracted energy of people attending an obligation rather than an event. The Dravathi representative, a tall figure named Councillor Veth, sat at the curved table, with the particular stillness of someone who has already decided the meeting does not concern them. I took my observer seat and opened my notes file. The session chair called the room to order, and noted that the primary item was a status review of the Vareth Prime incident. She noted that the human delegation had submitted a recorded statement in lieu of a live representative, which was procedurally unusual, but not without precedent. She signaled the communications officer to play it. The room lights dimmed slightly, as they always did for holographic playback. The image that appeared above the central table was a woman I had never seen before. She was perhaps 60 years old, with short white hair and a face that had been weathered by what looked like decades of careful, sustained attention to difficult things. She wore a dark uniform with no decorative rank insignia that I could identify. Just a small pin at the jacket collar, shaped like something I could not make out at that resolution. She was seated at a plain desk, her hands folded in front of her, and she looked directly into the recording lens with the unhurried steadiness of someone who has no interest in performing calm because calm is simply what she is. Her name, a text footer confirmed, was Admiral Constance Hale. She said, "Humanity has noted the events of the 9th of this cycle at Vareth Prime. 4,217,041 of our people are gone. We have completed our accounting." Her voice was level. Not flat. Level. There is a difference. Flat has no weight. Level is what you hear when someone has taken something enormous and placed it on an internal scale, and found that the scale still holds, she said, in accordance with our rights under the Assembly Charter, Article 19, Paragraph 4. Humanity is exercising its right of proportional response. This is a formal notification to all Assembly members and affiliated observers. The Dravathi councillor Veth shifted slightly in his seat. It was the first time I had seen him move since the session began. The Admiral said, "Fleet positioning has begun." Then the recording ended. The room was quiet for a moment. Then the Polari delegate said, with the careful tone of someone managing a situation, that this was expected, and that the Assembly would need to review the proportionality parameters under Charter to ensure compliance. The Dravathi councillor said, with a dismissiveness that made the air feel thin, "Humanity's registered fleet capacity places them well below any threshold that would concern the supremacy." He said it the way someone says something they believe is permanently true. He said it the way someone talks about the weather. I was not watching him. I was watching the communications officer at the far side of the room, who had just quietly pressed something on her panel, and was now staring at her screen, with an expression I had never seen on her face before. She had been working this station for 11 years. She had an unshakable quality that I had always admired. Her name was Yenna, and I had once seen her calmly reroute 3 simultaneous emergency channels during a border crisis without raising her voice or spilling her water. She was gripping the edge of her panel. I stood from my observer seat and crossed to her station, which I was not supposed to do during a formal session. The chair made a soft noise of protest. I did not stop. I looked at Yenna's screen. She was tracking fleet signatures. It was a standard deep-range passive sensor readout, the kind that ran in the background of every assembly station at all times, logging the movement of registered vessels through shared transit corridors. The display was a scatter field of green points representing known, identified ships at their logged positions. There were new points appearing on the screen. Not one, not a cluster. They were appearing the way stars appear when your eyes adjust to the dark. One, then another, then too many to count individually, spreading across the sensor field in a slow, enormous bloom. I said, "What am I looking at?" she said. "I do not know yet. The registry is trying to pull identification tags. It keeps timing out." I said, "How many signals?" She said, "The counter stopped updating when it passed 40,000. It has been a few minutes since then." I looked at the scatter field. The points were still appearing. I said, "It has not stopped, has it?" She said, "No. It has not stopped." Behind me, the session chair was speaking. A delegate was asking a procedural question. The Dravathi councillor was saying something about proportionality thresholds. The ordinary machinery of the assembly was grinding forward, because that is what institutions do. They grind forward, because grinding forward is what they were built to do, and they do not always know when to stop. I walked back to the center of the room. I did not use my observer's voice. I used a louder one. I said, "Someone needs to connect the deep-range sensor feed to the main display." The chair looked at me with sharp disapproval. I said, "Please. Now." There was a pause. Then the chair looked at the communications officer, who was still at her station, and nodded. The main display above the central table changed. The scatter field appeared there, projected large enough for every person in that room to see every point of light. The counter in the corner of the display was still climbing. 61,000. 62,000. 63. The room went completely silent. Counselor Veth rose slowly from his seat. He stood very still, looking at the display. The dismissive quality that he had carried into the room with him like a coat had quietly left. I watched his face. He was doing the same thing I was doing. He was counting. He was trying to make the numbers fit into a frame that his understanding of the galaxy could support. He was trying to reconcile the 4,300 vessels on humanity's last registry submission with what he was watching climb across the display in front of him. The counter passed 80,000. A delegate, I believe it was the Sorvani representative, though I am not certain, made a sound that was not quite a word. The chair said, "Can we get identification on those signals?" Yenna said, "From across the room, they are all flagging as human registry. Every one of them." The Dravathi counselor sat back down. He did not say anything about proportionality thresholds after that. 112,000. I returned to my observer seat. I opened my notes file. My hands were steady, which surprised me, because my mind was anything but. I had spent my career as a trained observer. I had filed reports on disputed borders, species conflicts, treaty violations, and one extraordinary session during which a senior delegate had produced a historical document that invalidated 3 centuries of territorial law. I had seen things. I had not seen anything like this. 158,000. The session chair made a procedural attempt to continue the meeting. She said that the assembly would need time to assess the data, and that the session should perhaps be temporarily. She paused. She looked at the display. She closed her notes. She said, "The session is suspended pending situational review." No one argued with that. 204,000. I wrote in my notes file, "The fleet registry submission was false. Not fraudulent, false by omission. Humanity did not hide their ships by misreporting them. They hid them by building ships that no one thought to look for. The registry shows what was registered. No species in this assembly ever thought to ask whether what was registered was all there was." I wrote, "We accepted the submission because we assumed species report what they have. We assumed that because every species in this assembly has always had some incentive to report accurately, to signal strength, to deter rivals, to secure treaty terms proportional to their capability." I wrote, "It appears that humanity had a different strategy." 260,000. I looked up from my screen. The room was very quiet. Delegates were talking to each other in low voices. Some of them were on personal communication devices, presumably reporting back to their home governments. The Dravathi counselor was still seated, not talking to anyone, looking at the display with an expression I had seen on faces before but not often. The expression of someone watching a version of reality they constructed very carefully coming apart in front of them. 311,000. I thought about Owen Garrett, his tidy desk, his calm gray eyes, his steady hands. I thought about how I had asked him if he was afraid, and he had said no. I understood it differently now. He had not been afraid because he had known this was coming. He had known the way someone knows that morning is coming when they have been watching the darkness for long enough. Not with anxiety, but with the quiet certainty of someone who has simply been awake longer than everyone else in the room. 387,000. I wrote, "I do not think this is a response to Verath Prime." I wrote, "I think Verath Prime was a trigger, not a cause. I think the fleet existed before Verath Prime. I think it has been existing for a very long time. In the dark, in the silence, in all the spaces we were not looking." 399,000. One of the junior delegates near the back of the room, a young Pilari on her first posting, I had spoken with her briefly at the session's start, said, in a voice that was quieter than she probably intended, "When did they build all of that?" No one answered her. No one had an answer. 450,000. I closed my notes file. I held very still. Outside the station, in the vast cold dark that runs between stars and holds no allegiance to anything, something that humanity had built over decades of extraordinary, patient silence was arranging itself along the border of Dravathi space, with the slow, terrible deliberateness of a closing hand. 490,000. The counter paused at 492,000 for nearly 20 seconds. I thought, for a moment, that it might be over. That the sensor array had reached its limit. That the number was simply the number and we were done with the counting. Then it moved again. 497,000, 499,000, 500,000, and 4. The display held. I stared at it for a long time. Then I opened a new section of my notes and wrote a single question. Who are these people? I had thought I knew. 62 years of assembly membership, trade agreements, cultural exchanges, diplomatic sessions, Owen Garrett and his tea, provisional status and modest fleet submissions, and a quiet, unremarkable presence in the corridors of galactic politics. I had thought I knew. I had been wrong in a way that I was only beginning to understand the full size of. 500,000 warships held position at the Dravathi border. And in the session room of the Galactic Assembly, not one voice spoke above a whisper. The answer arrived the way the most important answers always do. Not with fanfare, but with the dry, methodical thoroughness of someone who has had a very long time to prepare their paperwork. 3 days after the assembly session, after the sensor feed had stabilized, and the registry office had processed enough identification tags to confirm that yes, every point of light on that display was a human warship, after every major government in the assembly had spent 72 hours sending urgent transmissions to their intelligence offices and receiving answers that ranged from, "We do not know," to, "We may have missed something significant." 3 days after all of that, I sat down and did what I should have done on the first day. I read everything. Not just the diplomatic files, not just the incident reports. Everything. Trade agreements going back 40 years. Infrastructure contracts. Fuel depots registered under colonial development programs. Resource extraction licenses filed in the names of companies that I had never looked at closely, because there had been no reason to. Assembly transit corridor applications, each individually small, each noting the movement of civilian construction equipment to colonial frontier zones. I read every document I could access, and then I sent a formal research request to the Assembly Archive Office for the restricted commercial development records, citing my observer classification, and I waited 3 hours for the clearance to come through. Then I read those too, and the picture that emerged was not something that had been hidden. That was the thing that kept stopping me as I worked through file after file. It was not hidden. Every piece of it was in the public record, or close enough to the public record that it might as well have been. The fuel depot registrations, the construction equipment transit applications, the colonial infrastructure contracts awarded to human firms with names that meant nothing to anyone who was not looking for them, the resource agreements that had been filed as standard planetary development packages and processed without review because planetary development applications from developing species were routine and low priority, and no one had ever had a reason to scrutinize them. The archive that no one had ever thought to read. The first pattern I found was the fuel distribution network. Over a period of approximately 60 years, humanity had registered small fuel processing facilities across 217 colonial and frontier locations. Each one was modest by galactic standards. Too small to attract attention. Too numerous to map unless you were deliberately trying to map them. But when I placed them on a spatial chart, they formed something unmistakable. Not a random scatter. A grid. A carefully spaced, evenly distributed supply network that covered an enormous volume of space and could, in theory, support sustained fleet operations across an area roughly 12 times the size of any registered human territorial claim. You do not build a fuel network that size to support 4,300 ships. The second pattern was the construction timelines. Colonial infrastructure contracts typically referenced building schedules of 3 to 8 years for major surface installations. The human contracts I was reading referenced projects of 12, 15, 20 years, long past the point where any reasonable surface colony would need that level of infrastructure investment. Longer than the building cycles for any surface structure I could identify in the attached project specifications. I cross-referenced the project codes with the colonial census records and found something interesting. Several of the largest long-term construction sites showed no corresponding increase in the surface population of the colonies they were registered quest to. You do not build a 20-year surface project that requires no additional ground staff. Unless it is not a surface project. The third pattern was the one that made me sit back from my screen and spend several minutes doing nothing except looking at the far wall of my quarters. The species registry. Every species in the assembly was required to file an annual fleet capability report. These reports were submitted to the registry office and cross-referenced with transit corridor applications and fuel consumption data to produce a transit corridor applications. Verified fleet estimate. The process was designed to be self-correcting. A species that underreported its fleet would eventually show anomalous fuel consumption that did not match its reported vessel count, and the registry office would flag the discrepancy for review. Humanity had never been flagged. Their fuel consumption data had always matched their reported fleet numbers. Every year, for 62 years. The math had always worked out. It had always worked out because they had their own fuel network. The ships they were not reporting were not using assembly fuel corridors. They were fueling from the small, unremarkable network of processing facilities, registered as colonial infrastructure, scattered across 217 frontier locations, too numerous to map, too routine to review, completely invisible in plain sight. I filed a preliminary findings note to my senior counsel at 1400. By 1700, I had 7 response transmissions from council members who wanted to schedule calls. By 1900, I had a formal request from the Assembly Intelligence Subcommittee, asking me to share my research. At 2100, I was sitting in a conference room with 4 other analysts from 3 different species, and we were all looking at the same spatial chart with the fuel depot grid on it, and no one was saying very much. A Polari analyst named Sovi, someone I had worked with briefly years before, a careful and very precise thinker with a talent for logistics modeling, said eventually that he had run the numbers on the construction capacity implied by the long-cycle project sites. He said that if even 60% of those sites had been operating at the implied capacity for the past 30 years, the total manufacturing output was consistent with a fleet in the range of 400,000 to 600,000 vessels, he said. I ran that calculation 4 times because I did not believe it the first 3. A Sorvani analyst said, "How did no one see this?" I said, "We were not looking. There was no reason to look. They were a developing species in provisional membership, with a modest registered fleet, and no history of aggression and no alliances that suggested they were anything other than what they appeared to be." The Sorvani analyst said, "And what did they appear to be?" I said, "Small." The room was quiet after that. Small. That was the word. That was the whole of it. Humanity had appeared small, not weak. They had fought well enough in the minor border engagements they had been involved in, and there was nothing in their diplomatic conduct to suggest incompetence or instability. But small. A species still finding its place. A species building toward something. A species that registered 4,300 ships, because 4,300 ships was what a species their size was expected to register, and no one had ever thought to ask whether the expectation itself might be the trick. Sovi said, "I want to show you something else." He pulled up a chart of human diplomatic behavior over the past 40 years. Specifically, treaty negotiations. He had mapped every significant assembly treaty that had come to a vote during that period, and tracked how the human delegation had voted, and what amendments they had proposed or supported, and which provisions they had quietly advocated for in subcommittee sessions. The pattern was there immediately. Every treaty that expanded access to frontier resource zones, human delegation in favor. Every treaty that tightened regulations on colonial infrastructure classification, human delegation in opposition, always with reasonable-sounding procedural objections that delayed or softened the measure. Every negotiation that involved transit corridor definitions, human delegation present, attentive, and consistently working toward interpretations that would leave their frontier development programs technically outside standard corridor monitoring requirements. Not illegally, not deceptively, procedurally, within the rules, with arguments that held up to scrutiny individually, because individually they were about reasonable things: colonial development rights, frontier access, infrastructure investment for emerging species. Put together, they were something else. They were 40 years of quietly shaping the legal environment to make everything they were doing invisible. Sovi said. They were not hiding. I said no. he said. They were gardening. I thought that was exactly the right word. They had been gardening the regulatory landscape for 40 years, tending it, shaping it, not with the heavy hand of a species trying to conceal wrongdoing, but with the patient precision of builders who understood that the easiest way to keep something from being noticed is to make sure the rules that would require noticing it are never quite written the way they would need to be. The Sorvani analyst said, "Do you think they planned all of this from the beginning?" I said I did not know. I said that it did not necessarily require a single master plan from the first day of assembly membership. It required a species that was very good at thinking in long time frames. A species that looked at a 60-year horizon the way most species looked at a 5-year horizon. A species that had perhaps learned, somewhere in its history, that the most durable kind of power is the kind that is built so slowly and so quietly that no one around you notices the building, the Polari analyst said, and then something like Verath Prime happens, and the building is done, and they step out of it. I said, yes. No one spoke for a moment. Then Sovi said, the fleet has been at the Dravathi border for 71 hours. There has been no movement, no transmission from the human side, no ultimatum filed with the assembly. I said, there will be one, he said. When? I said, when they are ready. And I thought about Admiral Constance Hale, sitting at her plane desk with her hands folded, looking into the recording lens with the patience of someone who has spent their whole life waiting for precisely this moment and has never once been in a hurry to reach it. I thought about what it meant to build for 80 years. I thought about what it meant to have 500,000 ships and say nothing, do nothing, hold position, and wait. The Dravathi High Council received the transmission at 0600 on the 4th day of the fleet's positioning. I know this because I was given access to the diplomatic log as part of my expanded research clearance, and the log timestamp is unambiguous. I also know, from a secondary source I will not name here, that all 7 members of the Dravathi High Council were present in their primary chamber when the transmission arrived, which was unusual for 0600. It suggests that they had been warned it was coming, or had been watching for it, or both. The transmission was not a recording this time. It was live. Admiral Constance Hale appeared on the Dravathi chamber display in real time. She was standing, not seated. Behind her was an operations room, not the staged, carefully lit kind used for political messaging, but a real one, with officers at stations and displays running data that I would very much have liked to see more clearly. She looked exactly as she had in the recorded message. White hair, steady face, that small pin at her collar. She said, "This communication is being logged and transmitted simultaneously to the Assembly Record Office and will form part of the permanent Galactic Legal Guild archive. You may verify that with the registry now if you choose." The Dravathi High Council chose. There was a pause of approximately 90 seconds. Then the council confirmed the transmission was indeed being archived in real time. The Admiral said, "Good," she said. On the 9th of this cycle, at 0214 Galactic Standard Time, forces under the authority of the Dravathi Supremacy conducted a military action against the human colony of Verath Prime. I am not going to describe what happened there again. It is in the record. Everything is in the record, she said. I am going to describe instead what we have done since then, she said. In the 72 hours following the event, our Casualty Accounting Division completed a full census reconciliation for Verath Prime. 4,217,041 people. We have their names, we have their records, we know who they were. Not as a number, but as individuals. Their professions, their family relationships, their ages, their contributions to their communities and to their world. We know who among them was a child and who was an elder, and who was born on Verath Prime, and who had come from another human world seeking something better. We have filed that complete record with the Assembly Archive. It is public. Anyone who wishes to know who died there can know. Their names will not be a statistic. She paused. She said, "We also completed a second accounting, an economic accounting. The projected generational contribution of 4 million individuals across a standard human lifespan, the infrastructure investment represented by a colony 23 years in development, the scientific and cultural output that will not exist because these people will not live to create it, We have expressed this in assembly standard value units and filed it as a separate document in the archive. The number is large. You are welcome to review it." She paused again. She said, "I want to be clear about why I am telling you this before I tell you what comes next." She said, "What happened at Vareth Prime was not an incident. It was not a clearance. It was not a territorial adjustment. It was the end of 4 million individual lives, each of which had value that cannot be expressed in any currency and can only be imperfectly approximated by the accounting we have filed. I want the record to reflect that we know this, that we do not require the acknowledgement of this chamber to know it, that our response is not driven by an abstract geopolitical calculus, but by the specific, documented, named reality of what your forces did to our people." The Dravathi High Council said nothing. The Admiral said, "Here is what we are offering you." She said, "We are offering you one option, a single option. There is no second option, so there is no need to negotiate between them." She said, "You will acknowledge, before the Assembly and the Permanent Galactic Record, full responsibility for the action taken at Vareth Prime. You will submit your command structure for review by a tribunal established under joint human and Assembly authority. Every officer who ordered, authorized, or executed the strike will be named in the record and will answer to that tribunal. You will provide complete military and administrative cooperation with the process. And you will accept, as part of the settlement, a reparations structure that we have already drafted and filed with the Assembly Legal Office this morning, which you may review now if you have not already done so." She said, "If you accept this offer, the fleet holds position, and the matter proceeds through the legal process I have described." She said, "If you do not accept this offer within 6 hours of the end of this transmission, the fleet advances." She said, "I want to be precise about what I mean by advances. I do not mean a demonstration. I do not mean a border incursion designed to apply pressure. I mean that 500,000 warships will cross into Dravathi space, with the objective of ensuring that the Dravathi supremacy is permanently unable to conduct operations of the kind carried out at Vareth Prime. I will not elaborate on what that means because I believe the plain meaning is sufficient," she said. 6 hours. Then she said one more thing. She said, "I want to address something that I suspect is occurring to your council right now. You may be asking yourselves whether we actually have the will to do what I have described. You may be thinking that humanity has not historically projected this level of force, and that there is therefore reason to doubt that we would use it. I understand why that thought would occur to you," she said. "I would like you to consider where that thought comes from." She said, "You formed your understanding of humanity based on what we showed you. We showed you what was useful for us to show you. We registered what it served our purposes to register. We participated in assembly processes in ways that served our long-term goals. We were not deceptive. We were selective. Every species is selective about what it reveals. The difference between us and most species in this assembly is that we were selective for a very long time and over a very large scale." She said, "What you are looking at now, on your border, is not the exception. It is not the hidden capacity we scrambled together in 9 days because we were desperate and grieving. It is what we built because we are patient people, and we learned a long time ago that the galaxy rewards patience differently than it rewards noise." She said, "The question of whether we have the will is the wrong question." She said, "The question is whether you believe, after the last 4 days, that you ever really knew us well enough to answer it." Then she said goodbye and the transmission ended. I was given access to the recording within the hour, and I watched it twice. Then I sat with it for a while. Then I wrote in my notes file. I wrote, "She did not threaten them. She offered them a choice, and described the consequences of each path with the same tone she might use to describe a weather forecast. She was not performing restraint. She was not suppressing emotion for the sake of appearing strong. She was simply, genuinely, completely at ease with the reality of what she was saying, because she had been living with that reality for a very long time, and it had ceased to be frightening to her." I wrote, "That is the most unsettling thing I have ever witnessed in a diplomatic context. Not the fleet, not the numbers, the fact that she was not unsettled by any of it." I wrote, "We have spent 62 years thinking of humanity as a species becoming. We assumed that what we were seeing was the early stage of something that would eventually resemble us. We assumed they were moving toward the galaxy as we had built it. I wrote, I think we had it backwards. I wrote, I think we were always the ones being watched. I think the question was never who humanity would become. The question, which we never thought to ask, was what they had already decided to be. The Dravathi High Council accepted the terms at the 4-hour and 22-minute mark. I noted the time in my log, 4 hours and 22 minutes. Not the full 6. They had not waited to demonstrate resolve, or to extract a negotiating concession in the remaining time. They had simply looked at what was on their border, looked at the document on their screens, and accepted. I have thought about that a great deal since then. The Assembly convened a formal session 2 days later to process the Dravathi acknowledgement and establish the tribunal framework. It was the largest attended session in the Assembly's history. Every accredited delegation present, every observer seat filled, several species attending via remote link, whose delegations were not normally active participants in plenary sessions. The chamber had a quality I had never experienced in it before. Not excitement exactly. Something closer to the feeling in a room after a very loud sound has just stopped. The session proceeded with great procedural care. The chair was meticulous. Every item was properly moved, seconded, debated where debate was required, and recorded. The tribunal framework was established. The reparations document was formally entered into the record. The Dravathi acknowledgement was read aloud and confirmed. All of it happened exactly as institutional processes are supposed to happen. And underneath all of it, in every corridor conversation, and every hushed exchange between delegates, and in every message being transmitted from that station to every government in the galaxy, the same question was running. It was not a new question. It was the question the junior Polari delegate had asked in the censor room 4 days ago, and the question Sovi had been circling around in our research session, and the question that had been sitting at the back of every conversation I had participated in since the fleet appeared on the display. But now it had a harder edge. Now it was not theoretical, because the tribunal framework had been agreed. The reparations schedule had been filed. The process was proceeding, and the fleet was still there. Not advancing, not withdrawing, still there. 500,000 warships on the Dravathi border, holding position with the same patient stillness they had held since the first point of light appeared on Yena's sensor display. No one had asked when they would leave. I think no one had asked because no one was quite sure what the answer would mean. On the morning after the session, I found Sovi in the archive wing. He was not working. He was sitting at one of the long reading tables with a cup of tea that had gone cold, and a display screen that was showing a spatial map of the outer frontier zones. The map had small markers on it. He had been placing them manually. I sat across from him and looked at the map. The markers were in locations that were not associated with any registered human fleet position. They were spread across the frontier, in a pattern that I recognized immediately, because I had spent 3 days studying a very similar pattern. Infrastructure sites. The ones from the colonial development records. The ones with long construction timelines and no corresponding population increase. But not the ones I had found. New ones. I said, those are not in the files I reviewed. He said, no, these are from the secondary archive. Infrastructure licenses filed under a different registry category. Not colonial development. Agricultural support facilities. I said, agricultural support, he said. Grain storage. Environmental monitoring arrays. Soil processing units. Things so routine that they have their own subcategory in the filing system, specifically so they can be batch processed without manual review, he said. I started looking at them last night. I have been looking at them for 8 hours. He looked at me. He said, Valsa, there are a lot of them. I looked at the map. The markers were not clustered near known human space. They were not grouped around the existing fleet positions or the fuel depot network I had already mapped. They were spread across an entirely different region. Frontier zones that were, by assembly convention, considered uninhabited and undeveloped. Zones that were far enough from established transit corridors that no routine monitoring sweep would pass through them on a regular schedule. Zones where you could build for a very long time without anyone noticing. I said, how long have the licenses been active? He said, the oldest ones I have found are 43 years old. I sat with that, he said. The fleet we watched appear on that sensor display, 500,000 ships, built over what we now know is approximately 80 years, fueled by a network we found in 3 days of looking. That is the fleet they chose to show us, he said. I keep thinking about something the Admiral said. I said, which part? He said, the part where she said they registered what it served their purposes to register. And then she said they were not deceptive. They were selective. He said, I keep thinking about what selective means over a long enough time frame. I keep thinking about what a species that thinks in 80-year horizons would consider worth being selective about. He said, I keep thinking about whether the agricultural support facilities are actually agricultural support facilities. I looked at the map, at the markers spread across the frontier like seeds in soil. I said, do you think they know we are looking? He said, I think they have always known we might look eventually. I think they planned for it. I said, and? He said, and I think they decided it did not matter. The cold tea sat between us. The map glowed quietly on the screen. Outside the station, in the enormous dark that held everything, the fleet held its position and said nothing, and waited with the infinite patience of something that had been built for exactly this and had never been in any hurry at all. I thought about Owen Garrett's empty office, the sign on the door, the tea things put away. I thought about how I had stood in that doorway and felt the particular quality of a silence that is full rather than empty. I thought about the Admiral's last question to the Dravathi, whether they believed they had ever really known humanity well enough to know what humanity would or would not do. And I thought about what it meant that the same question now sat, quiet and immovable, in front of every species in the assembly, including mine. Sovi reached out and turned off the display. He said, I am going to file a preliminary report. I think you should file one too. I said, what will we say in it? He said, the truth, as best we can determine it. I said, and what is that? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that we have been looking at humanity for 62 years, and we have been seeing what they allowed us to see. That the image we built of them, small, developing, modest, harmless, was not fabricated by them. It was assembled by us, from the pieces they gave us, in the shape we expected. And we were wrong. Not because we failed to be careful. We were wrong because we were looking with the wrong assumptions. And no amount of careful looking with the wrong assumptions will show you what is actually there, he said. And I think our report should note that the wrong assumptions are still in place for everything we have not yet looked at, he said. And I think whoever reads the report should understand that we do not know how much we have not yet looked at. He stood, gathered his things, and walked toward the door. Then he stopped. He said, do you know what the Admiral's pin is? I said, the small one at her collar. No, I could not make it out at that resolution. He said, I asked the archive office to enhance the image. He said, it is a compass, an old human navigational instrument, the kind they used before any of their technology, the kind that always points in one direction, regardless of how far you have traveled or how lost everything else seems, he said. I do not know if that means anything. Then he left. I sat at the table for a long time after that. The archive wing was quiet around me. The station hummed with its ordinary life. Somewhere on the other side of known space, 500,000 warships sat at a border and held their silence. And in 1,000 government chambers across the galaxy, leaders were looking at maps and asking the same question in the same frightened voice. How much did we miss? I did not write in my notes file that day. I had been trained, over a long career, to observe and record, to find the shape of a thing in the data it left behind, to look at what was there and describe it accurately and completely. But what I was facing now was not the shape of a thing in the data. It was the shape of a thing in all the spaces where there was no data, the shape of absences, the shape of everything that had never been filed, never been flagged, never been sent through a transit corridor, or touched a fuel depot, or crossed a sensor array, because it had not needed to, because it had been built in the dark, slowly, over a human lifetime, by a people who understood better than any species in the assembly the one true strategic lesson that history teaches again and again, to anyone patient enough to study it long enough to learn it. The most powerful thing in any room is the thing no one has thought to look for yet. Humanity had known that. They had built with it, and the galaxy, sitting in the stunned silence of its own incomplete knowledge, was only now beginning to understand that the counting was not done. It had barely begun. The final entry in my official incident file for Verath Prime read, "Matter resolved. Tribunal established. Reparations schedule confirmed. Fleet status, holding." I looked at that last word for a long time. Holding. Not withdrawing. Holding. And somewhere in the frontier zones mapped with quiet markers on Sovi's cold tea display, agricultural support facilities hummed with power that had nothing to do with grain. I closed the file. I opened my private notes. I wrote, "We were never watching humanity." I wrote, "They were watching us." I wrote, "I think they still are." Then I saved the file, locked it with my cipher, and sat for a while in the quiet of the archive wing, listening to the station breathe around me, and thinking about a compass that always points in one direction, no matter how lost everything else becomes. I thought about patience. I thought about what a species builds when it has decided to be something the galaxy does not yet have a name for. And I thought about the silence. The first one. The one after Verath Prime. The one I had watched and written about and flagged and worried over and not fully understood. I understood it now. It had not been grief. It had not been helplessness. It had not been the quiet of a small species that did not know what to do in the face of catastrophe. It had been the quiet of 500,000 ships, already in position, already fueled, already crewed, holding in the dark, saying nothing, waiting for the order that had always been going to come. The silence had not been empty. It had never been empty. It had been the fullest thing I had ever heard, and I had not known how to listen to it. I know now, and I will not make that mistake again.
What? Yeah, we need to lock in, bro. It's only a 4-point game.